never imagined that a standard medical procedure could ignite a chain of events capable of unraveling my family from the inside out. My name is Carmen Mercer, and until recently, I believed that doing the responsible thing would at least earn basic understanding, if not appreciation, from the people who raised me. But the truth became painfully clear the moment I told my father that I couldn't delay my surgery just so it wouldn't interfere with a birthday celebration. A decision that should have been straightforward suddenly became the spark that exposed decades of imbalance. The argument erupted before I could even finish explaining. My father reacted as if the surgery were a casual appointment that could be shifted around a party schedule. Meanwhile, my older brother's birthday gathering had somehow become the most sacred event on our family calendar. Dad insisted I attend because, to him, family obligations mattered above everything. When I reminded him I would be under anesthesia in 48 hours, he stared at me as though I had committed some unthinkable betrayal. He told me I was destroying the entire weekend. Then he delivered the sentence that severed whatever remained between us. If I couldn't make a simple sacrifice for the family, then I shouldn't expect to be part of it. 30 days later, life flipped in ways no one could have predicted. My father ended up in the ICU with no one beside him, while the same son he adored more than anyone else was uploading photos of beaches and cocktails from Hawaii. And that was when my phone began ringing again, his name lighting the screen as if the words he once threw at me had evaporated. Despite everything he said, he still called. Are you reading this during the day or at night? Comment below. I want to know when my story is keeping you company. To understand how everything collapsed so violently, I need to take you back to the quieter years that shaped the imbalance in ways I never fully recognized. My mother died when I was young enough to confuse silence with grieving. That left our house anchored by Dad, my brother Brandon, and me. Dad tried to keep our world moving forward, but his attention settled naturally and easily on Brandon. It was visible even before I had the language to describe favoritism. He stayed up late helping Brandon with school projects while telling me I was capable enough to handle my own. I learned to cook dinners because Dad believed Brandon needed more time to focus on his future. And I accepted these things because I never wanted to make life harder for him. Brandon and I were only a few years apart, but Dad treated our needs as if they belonged to different generations. When I once asked him to attend an award ceremony at school, he told me Brandon had practice he couldn't miss. So I stood alone on stage collecting my certificate, pretending it didn't matter. The program from that night remained tucked away in a drawer, even though the moment never really left me. The only person who seemed to notice the uneven load I carried was my grandfather, Harold Mercer. Grandpa visited often, always making sure I had someone who listened without glancing at a clock. He sat with me at the kitchen table and asked about my day with a patience no one else offered. He told me that responsibility was a strength rather than a burden, though his meaning didn't fully reach me back then. He gifted me small notebooks to write down anything that frustrated or hurt me, encouraging honesty in moments when I felt invisible. His words planted a quiet confidence I would later cling to. There were countless small moments revealing that my role in our family had been predetermined long before I understood the rules. Dad let Brandon start driving before he was ready while telling me insurance costs made it too expensive for me to learn. Brandon's broken phone was replaced immediately, mine took weeks. Anytime the family made plans, Brandon's preferences dictated the direction. I avoided conflict by staying quiet, but the pattern accumulated in my mind like subtle reminders that my worth depended entirely on how easy I made life for others, and yet those years shaped something steady in me. I learned how to manage responsibilities without expecting support. I learned how to correct my own mistakes because no one else would catch them. I learned to differentiate affection from approval. Dad often praised my independence as a reason he didn't need to offer help, only to resent that same independence when I made choices that didn't center the family. What I didn't realize then was how deeply those early patterns would shape every conflict that came after. By the time the argument about my surgery surfaced, the fractures in our family had existed for years, even if none of us had spoken them aloud. 3 days before the procedure, the cracks that had been quietly forming began to reveal themselves openly. I prepared myself for the conversation, knowing it would require patience and clarity. Even though neither had ever changed my father's reactions when Brandon's interests were involved, I waited until he finished reviewing details for the upcoming birthday gathering. When he finally gave me his attention, I explained the surgery date, the doctor's orders, and why the schedule couldn't shift. That I expected at least a hint of recognition about the seriousness of the situation. Instead, his eyes drifted back to his paper as though I had mentioned something forgettable. He asked whether the timing was flexible because Brandon wanted me to help with decorations. I told him the appointment had been set weeks earlier and moving it would delay recovery. The air thickened immediately. He let out a sigh that carried disappointment and irritation, as though I had deliberately chosen the wrong priority. He reminded me that family events required full participation, though his definition of that word had always shifted depending on who was involved. I repeated that the hospital schedule was fixed. He slammed the paper down with sharp annoyance and demanded to know why I wasn't willing to be a little accommodating. Brandon walked in mid-discussion, pausing briefly before Dad told him I was refusing to adjust my plans. Brandon turned to me with a calm, polite tone that disguised the pressure beneath it. "Can't you move it just a bit? It would really help if you tried," he said. His voice was soft, but the expectation was unmistakable. I explained that surgeries aren't appointments you casually rearrange, and that I needed to prepare. Brandon insisted finding another date couldn't be that difficult, even though he had no idea about the waiting lists I had already navigated. The tension rose as they kept pushing for a compromise that was never reasonable, and once again that same old imbalance reappeared, the pattern from my childhood where my needs were always flexible, and theirs were treated as unchangeable. Dad repeated that a small adjustment on my part would spare everyone unnecessary trouble, and his words only tightened the frustration building in my chest. I asked if they actually understood what the surgery involved or if they believed recovery was something simple. Dad didn't answer. Instead, he pivoted straight back to the celebration, acting as if nothing else mattered. The tension sharpened when I refused to back down. Dad said, "You should think about the family before you think about yourself." I replied calmly, "I am thinking about the family, but I can't ignore the doctor's instructions." Brandon looked annoyed, though he hid it behind a strained smile. "You always make things more complicated than they need to be," he said, words that hit far deeper than he realized because they echoed the belief that had shaped our home for years that I forced myself to stay steady. If I lost my composure, it would only confirm the version of me they had already decided on. I reminded them that the surgery had been scheduled after multiple evaluations and postponing it would lengthen my recovery. Dad's expression hardened as he stepped back. He muttered that he expected more cooperation from me, insisting that the celebration's timing mattered to everyone. In that moment, it became painfully clear, my health was nowhere in his priorities, nothing was resolved. The conversation ended in a heavy silence that stayed with me long after I stepped out of the room. I felt drained but strangely clear-headed. The cracks I had spent years ignoring were now unmistakable, visible in every word spoken that day. What surprised me most was the calm I felt as I walked away. The day of the surgery arrived faster than I expected. As I drove to Houston Cypress Park Medical for check-in, the weight of the past few days pressed hard against my thoughts. I felt calm, but it was the kind of calm that comes from sheer exhaustion. At the admissions desk, I answered the usual questions and accepted a clipboard full of forms. I tried to focus, but the tension still tightened around my breath. Before I could finish the first page, my phone started buzzing. Dad's name lit up the screen. The timing felt intentional. I hesitated, knowing he would just keep calling, and finally answered. His voice was sharp from the first second. Leave the hospital and come help your family. This surgery can wait. His demand hit me hard, knocking the warmth from my hands. I told him quietly that I was already checked in and the medical team was preparing everything. He insisted that my presence at the celebration mattered far more than any procedure, something he said could easily be postponed if I actually cared. That I tightened my grip on the phone but kept my tone controlled. I told him again that I wasn't changing the plan. Without missing a beat, he accused me of choosing myself over the family and said he didn't have time for someone who refused to cooperate. Then he ended the call. The silence afterward was louder than anything he'd said. I stood still until footsteps approached. It was my best friend, Nina Harper, who came despite me trying to minimize everything. She studied my face before asking if I needed a moment. I handed her the clipboard just to steady myself. Nina told me I deserved support, especially today, and that I didn't need to carry the guilt my family kept putting on me. Her presence grounded me without demanding anything. She stayed beside me while I finished the paperwork, talking gently until my breathing evened out again. A nurse arrived to take me to pre-op. With every step down the quiet hallway, the reality of everything settled in deeper. The conflict with Dad hurt, not because I expected him to support me, but because a small part of me had still hoped for it. This surgery wasn't a whim, it was one of the first decisions I made entirely for myself, refusing to bend just because they wanted me to. While the nurse reviewed instructions, my phone buzzed again in my pocket. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Anxiety rose, but so did clarity. Nothing I said would change his viewpoint. I silenced the phone and powered it off. The room felt lighter the moment the screen went black. When they called my name, I stepped forward. Letting that door close behind me felt like shutting years of hurt on the other side. 2 weeks later, I returned home after discharge, relieved, exhausted, and moving slowly as the post-surgery ache reminded me to be careful. My apartment felt familiar yet distant, as though time had stretched differently inside the hospital. I eased onto the couch, hoping home would bring comfort, but the silence reminded me that healing wasn't just physical, it required peace. Something my family had made nearly impossible. As I adjusted my pillows and tried to settle, notifications lit up my phone with a jarring brightness. Brandon had posted an entire stream of photos and videos from the celebration he hosted the night before. He was in the center of every shot, laughing, showing off gifts, surrounded by people cheering him on. None of the captions mentioned what I had been going through. What struck me most was how enthusiastically people celebrated him, completely unaware that, while he enjoyed the spotlight, I had been lying in a hospital bed. He hadn't sent even a single message to ask how I was doing. His party looked so extravagant it could have passed for a small festival, and the contrast cut deeper than I wanted to admit. My phone buzzed all afternoon as relatives messaged one after another, each carrying some accusation shaped by a story they had been told, one I knew wasn't true. Dad had taken it upon himself to explain my absence, but his version painted me as someone who had refused to support the family over something insignificant. I read texts claiming that I had embarrassed him, disappointed everyone, and needed to apologize for the inconvenience I had caused. Not a single message asked about my recovery or whether the surgery had gone well. That I placed my phone face down and let the room grow quiet again. I was too drained to defend myself against a lie built to protect someone else's pride. Instead, I focused on the small tasks that helped me feel present again. I cooked simple meals, took slow walks around my apartment, and kept track of my medication. The act of caring for myself, without waiting for permission or approval, gave me a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I realized that silence could be a kind of refuge, not a punishment, when I used it to protect my peace instead of avoiding conflict. My body needed time, and so did my mind, and I finally allowed both to move at their own pace instead of bending to anyone else's expectations. One afternoon, my phone lit up with a name that always made me stop: my grandfather. He was the first and only person who had checked on me without judgment. He asked gently if I had everything I needed. He didn't push for details or twist his concern into leverage. He simply wanted to know if I felt safe and comfortable. His voice held a quiet sincerity that loosened something tight inside me. I told him I was taking things day by day, and he encouraged me to keep doing exactly that. The call lasted only a few minutes, but it felt more healing than anything else in those weeks. When the silence returned, so did a truth I had avoided for a very long time. The distance between me and the rest of my family didn't start with this surgery. It had been there for years, only now it was finally visible in a way I could no longer ignore. A month after the surgery, Dad's name appeared on my phone for the first time since he told me he had nothing to say to someone who chose herself over her family. I had just finished a follow-up appointment, and seeing his name felt surreal. A tremor of instinct warned me the call wouldn't bring comfort. I let it ring until it stopped. Minutes later, another call arrived, this one from Houston Cypress Park Medical. A nurse introduced herself, her tone carrying a weight that tightened my breath. She explained that Dad had been admitted to the ICU after a sudden stroke and that the doctors needed an immediate family member to sign consent for a procedure that couldn't wait. The news reopened a place inside me I thought had healed. I asked whether Brandon was coming, and the nurse hesitated before explaining that he had answered with a brief remark about being unable to leave a trip he had planned in Hawaii. The disbelief hung in the air long after the call ended. The device vibrated again. This time, Dad's voice came through, weak, uneven. "Carmen, please pick up." Hearing him say my name pulled me into a conflict I wasn't ready to face. His next words carried a plea he'd never spoken before: "I need you here." The exhaustion in his voice revealed a truth he'd never been willing to admit. I struggled to reconcile this fragile version of him with the man who had dismissed my surgery as nothing more than an inconvenience. I stood in my kitchen trying to steady my thoughts. The hospital needed a signature, and Brandon had already chosen to remain absent. I replayed Dad's earlier accusations about my choices, each memory clashing painfully with the reality that I had always stepped up when it mattered, even when no one acknowledged it. The phone rang again. I heard him breathing, each sound carrying urgency and regret as he whispered my name. A part of me wanted to go, another part felt the barrier created by years of being dismissed. The hospital sent a follow-up message explaining that the decision needed to be made before the afternoon ended. There was no guarantee the window would stay open. My eyes drifted to the discharge papers still sitting on my counter, reminders of how hard I had fought to recover. The idea of stepping into another crisis so soon felt overwhelming. Yet Brandon's silence, once again, exposed the truth of our family dynamic. Responsibility always landed on me. Dad tried one more time, his voice trembling with the knowledge that he had no one else. I felt the familiar weight of being the only steady person in a family that rarely offered steadiness in return. I didn't answer immediately, but the truth settled quietly inside me. I had never been the favored child, but I had always been the one who stayed. 2 days later, I walked into the hospital. I moved through the long hallway with a calmness that felt foreign, as if each step questioned why I had returned after years of being pushed aside. When I reached the ICU door, I paused to breathe before entering. Dad looked smaller than I remembered, but the sight didn't erase the weight of everything he had ignored. As soon as he saw me, he tried to speak. His voice cracked, searching for authority he no longer had. "Carmen, you came. I knew you would." The expectation behind his words wrapped around the room with a familiarity I had known my whole life. I stepped closer, keeping enough distance to protect the part of myself that had finally learned to stand on its own. "I came because the hospital called," I said, "not because you expected it." Dad tried to straighten himself, though the effort only made his breathing more strained. "You always turn things into something bigger than they are," he said. "I needed help. That should be enough." His tone carried the familiar cadence of excuses he had relied on for years, the same ones meant to twist responsibility back onto me. The tension in the room deepened as memories sharpened in my mind, memories I could no longer push aside. "You treated my surgery like it didn't matter," I said steadily. "You ignored every message when I needed someone. And you expected me to rearrange everything for Brandon, the way you always have." His face tightened as though my words stung more than he expected. He responded, "I raised you the best way I knew how. Families make sacrifices." His voice echoed old arguments that never acknowledged the weight he placed on me. I drew in a slow breath and answered, "I did make sacrifices. I made them alone when no one stood beside me. I made them quietly while you praised my brother for doing nothing. And you called me today because he refused to get on a plane." The silence that followed was heavier than the hum of the machines surrounding us. Dad looked away, and for a moment, I wondered if he finally understood that the story he repeated for years no longer held its shape. "I need you, Carmen," he whispered. This time, his words trembled, not with authority, but with fear. I stood at the foot of his bed, recognizing the old instinct within me, the instinct to fix everything, to patch every crack. But that instinct no longer controlled me. "Needing me now doesn't erase the past," I said. "It doesn't make me the person who cleans up every mess while Brandon gets to walk away." Dad tried again, desperation surfacing. "You can't turn your back on your family." It was his final attempt to reach the version of me who once would have surrendered without question. "You turned your back on me long before today," I replied. "I learned how to live without a father who saw me. And I'm choosing the same distance you created." A flicker ran through his eyes, something between regret and disbelief, but neither emotion changed the truth standing between us. A doctor stepped in briefly to check a monitor and left quickly when he sensed the tension. Dad reached out with a trembling hand, but I didn't move. "I hope you recover," I said quietly. "I truly do. But I'm done being the only one who shows up." His hands sank back to the bed, defeated. I turned toward the door, letting the silence close behind me like the final page of a chapter that had stretched on far too long. I walked out of the ICU without looking back. 1 week later, clarity settled over everything. The days moved with a calm rhythm, and each morning revealed a new consequence of choices made long before Dad's stroke. I slipped back into my routines, and my apartment, once filled with an ache, now felt like a place of closure. News about Dad spread quickly through the family. Conversations that once praised Brandon shifted. Relatives who used to admire him now questioned how he stayed in Hawaii while Dad fought through the aftermath of a stroke. Screenshots began appearing in my inbox, comments beneath Brandon's photos calling out the emptiness behind his carefully curated image. I didn't respond to any of them. The truth was unraveling on its own. Dad was discharged a few days later. He returned to a house that no longer carried the comfort he depended on. Brandon didn't visit him, not even after coming back from his trip. Their silence exposed a fracture that couldn't be hidden by old excuses. Dad reached out to relatives who had once reinforced his behavior, but those same people now kept their distance. Their hesitation mirrored the isolation he had created for himself. Grandpa told me that Dad spent most of his days in his room, speaking to almost no one. I felt no obligation to ease the loneliness built from years of dismissal. Grandpa, meanwhile, checked on me often, his calls warm, steady, and without pressure. He didn't ask me to explain anything or mend what wasn't mine to fix. His presence reminded me what genuine care felt like. My recovery progressed slowly but steadily. My body grew stronger, and so did my spirit. There was a freedom in living without the constant expectation to carry people who had never carried me. Brandon faced consequences of his own. His once admired reputation shifted into something brittle. Relatives who defended him suddenly struggled to justify his choices. The image he'd polished for years cracked under the weight of his neglect. He kept his distance, and for the first time, I knew our paths were unlikely to cross again in any meaningful way. Dad continued living in a quiet isolation that reflected the years he dismissed my needs. I realized that forgiveness didn't require closeness. Compassion didn't require returning to a dynamic that had harmed me. Distance could be an act of clarity, not anger. I spent more time with Grandpa. During one visit, I told him, I'm not going back to how things were. He nodded as though he had known all along that I would reach this point. His gentle support strengthened my resolve to break free from the cycle that shaped so much of my life. This entire journey taught me that boundaries aren't punishment, they're protection. Health isn't something to sacrifice for the comfort of others. No one should destroy themselves to maintain a role they never wanted. Family favoritism leaves long-lasting wounds, but healing begins when we honor our own voice. Choosing distance isn't abandonment. Sometimes, it is the only way to reclaim peace. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. I appreciate every moment you spent listening. I hope this journey offers something meaningful for your own life. Before you go, tell me, what would you have done in my place, and how do you view the choices each person made?